So welcome back to the John Locke Show, and we are still discussing the essay. We're still in book 2, but now we've jumped a bunch of chapters all the way from, I think our last one was chapter 8. Now we've jumped all the way up to chapter 27. Chapter 27 is titled Of Identity and Diversity. Really what's going on, this is Locke on personal identity. So Locke is going to have a look at basically what is this thing we call the self. And what is this self, not so much in terms of digging into what it really is, but when we say things like, oh, I'm the same self that I was yesterday, or yeah, I've changed a bit, but it's basically me. When we talk like that, Locke wants to ask, what are we really talking about? So it's clearly a term, self, clearly a way of talking, yeah, I was the same as yesterday, or I'm a different person now, or whatever. Locke wants to say, okay, we use this in everyday language, everyday discourse. What exactly do we mean by it? And the reason why he wants to look at this is, first, it's an old problem. He inherits it from Descartes, who transformed the problem in a variety of ways, and some of them pretty subtle. So Locke is more or less operating within kind of the Cartesian system, and the Cartesian tradition, but he is going to push against it. So to go into all the details of Descartes' notion is beyond the scope of this video, but what we're trying to do is follow Locke in how he talks about the self within the context of his empiricism. Now, recall, so far we've seen Locke, when he talks about knowledge, what is it? Well, it's basically built up. It's a construction. There's no a priori knowledge. Remember, Locke's got rid of that. So it's built up, it's a construction of ideas, none of which are innate. And of course, constructions of ideas, you put them together in some kind of, shall we say, a structure, and then linguistically you express that as a sentence. Anyways, these things we could call principles, these structures of ideas, those aren't innate either. So it all comes through experience. Remember, what's the ultimate source of ideas for Locke? He says one word, experience. Well, he says two sources are actually built into the notion of experience. You have experience of your sensations, like plain old garden variety bodily sensations. You know, you see stuff, you touch stuff, you taste stuff. Nothing fancy. And the operation of the mind on itself when it looks at its own manners of dealing with things, calls that reflection. Those are both kinds of experience, right? So one word experience breaks into sensation and reflection. Ideas, remember, they're not innate. They come in through these sources, and they can be simple and complex. And we looked at a few of those. So ideas combine in various ways, and they are also combined using the powers. Remember, powers, capacities, faculties, those are innate. Those are part of the mind at birth. So remember, tabula rasa really is a qualified tabula rasa, meaning no innate ideas or principles. The mind is not a complete blank slate. If it were, it couldn't learn anything. A blank piece of paper can't learn stuff. You can splash paint on it, but it doesn't learn anything. So even though Locke does say tabula rasa, even though Locke does say blank piece of paper, white paper, sometimes he even uses that expression that the mind is just like a white piece of paper. Don't take him too literally. Locke is a little bit casual about things, as we've seen. There is lots in the mind. Leibniz said Locke is really saying that there's nothing in the mind at birth except the intellect, which he meant by that a collection of faculties, powers. Abstraction, discerning, comparing, and so on. These, shall we say, are the engine, and ideas are the petrol, and that's how it gets going. All right, so now, with that bit we've seen, Locke is saying, let's take that machinery, look at personal identity. Now, in the background of all this, there is the problem of identity in a variety of ways that comes out in the tradition. What we're looking at with Locke's concern over identity can be thought of in terms of the ship of Theseus. which is an old story that you can find in Plutarch, an ancient a writer out of antiquity around AD 45 to 120, wrote a book called Lives. And they were actually parallel lives. He liked to take a Greek and a Roman and show how their lives were quite similar. So interesting work. But for our purposes here, there is this story called the Ship of Theseus. And you've probably heard it in a variety of ways. It comes up all the time in different contexts. So what's the basic story? I'm going to embellish it a little bit to try and bring out what's concerning Locke here. It is ultimately the concern over the notion of identity. You're not born with that idea. You're not born with it. You learn it over time. And so what Locke wants to say is you learn it in a certain way. There is a certain meaning to identity. It's not self-evident. Okay, what does this mean? Well, suppose you have a ship that's running, let's say, from one side of a lake to another, like a ferry taking people across. You can think of it that way. Now, over the years, the ship, as it's going back and forth, people are repairing it. Boards rot out on ships or whatever, they become loose. So part of the example is that imagine that this journey is quite a big one, and every time the board comes, or every time the ship comes back into dry dock, they take a board off, put it in a pile, put on a new board. So, and off the ship goes. So as it keeps going back and forth, you keep pulling off boards, throwing them on a pile, putting a new board, off the ship goes. And the ship keeps going back and forth. But notice, after a while, something curious happens. I keep saying that the ship goes back and forth. And that's true. A ship is going back and forth over, let's say, months or years. A big pile of boards is being slowly built up because, you take a board off, throw it on the pile, pile's getting bigger. Ship keeps going back and forth. Eventually, you've replaced, according to our example, just the parameters of it. Let's say you've replaced all the boards in the ship, right? You've more or less gone sequentially from, right, the hull all the way up, and you've replaced all the boards, thrown them on a pile, all new boards, and then you take all the old boards and you slap them together into into a ship. So now, all of a sudden, when you've got that pile assembled into a ship, the one that's been going back and forth comes in, you've got two ships in dry dock. The question now, they're both ships, no one's arguing that to characterize them as ships, they're ships. Right? One has new boards, so it might be in better shape than the other one. But the question is not that. The question is which one is the original ship, right? So which is the original ship? Now, the point that Locke wants to drive home in his whole discussion is identity is not something that is self-evident. Identity is something that occurs under conditions. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you say something like this, well, you know what? It's as you said, the ship is going back and forth. You peel a board off, put a new one on. The ship keeps going. So I'm going to say that the original ship is the one that just keeps going back and forth. What's the condition of claiming that that's the original ship? I would say it's the function. Right? That object that keeps going in that function, that pile over there didn't do anything, and then you just slapped it together. That pile of boards, yeah, it's a ship, but it hasn't been ferrying people back and forth. We're going to say of a functional approach that's the ship. That's the original ship. It's the one that just keeps going back and forth, little boards notwithstanding. Yank them out, put new ones in. It's basically a functional underpinning to the question of identity. So when you ask, which one's the original ship? I say the identity conditions are based on function, so the original ship is the one that kept doing the function thing. Okay, you could say that. You could also say, no. I think that the material aspect of the situation is the basis of which one is the real one. So when you took the champagne bottle and smacked it on the hull of the original ship, right, that was in dry dock before it left, that ensemble of material, that's the original ship. And that's what you accumulated over in that pile of boards. That's the original ship. This other one, whatever you want to call it, it's some kind of representation, or, the ship of Theseus Part 2 or whatever, I don't really care, but the material conditions are the conditions of identity. So the main point of this is that there's an argument to be had here, right? Which one? So now when you ask which one is the original ship, which one what are the identity conditions of the ship over time, you could say, well, they could be functional identity conditions or material identity conditions. Well, which one's right? Is it functional or material? Well, how would we adjudicate that? How would we decide that? Well, Locke says we're going to have to dig a little bit more into that, because we do think about these things in everyday life. The whole point of this discussion here, which is not in Locke, but it's a bit of a primer to get you used to the idea that when we ask about identity, you really have to say identity under what conditions. So the main point is that identity over time, this expression, this term, identity over time, you have to ask under what conditions, right? And in our example, the identity, under what conditions was in terms of the function and the material, the matter in question. So in that sense, this is a critical point for Locke's empiricist enterprise, is to realize that we're stuck at the level of observation. And so when we ask about identity conditions, and you can generalize this, for a variety of other concepts, how they apply, you might have to examine and argue about under what conditions. And in this one, it's not completely self-evident, right? That's the main point. You can make arguments for either, go ahead, be my guest. But the main point that Locke wants to drive home is you can't ultimately say, I just see one set or I see another set and that's the right answer. No, this is a matter of discussion. It's not self-evident. So this is the whole idea behind Locke's, again, his empiricist framework, is that a lot of the concepts we thought were so clean and clear, like logical concepts, mathematical concepts, even the concept of God, all these things, people thought they were just, innate, and therefore they are so clear to us. But again, Locke says, go ask a little kid what identity means. They don't know. They haven't a clue. You have to explain it to them. And the minute you start explaining it, you're presupposing some kind of background context, some kind of, identity. This is how you unpack it. And the minute you start going and unpacking it, you're in the land of some kind of conditions in the background. All right, so there's your little, shall we say, your intuition pump, as Daniel Dennett likes to say. It's a primer. It kind of gets you thinking about this, and that it's not self-evident. All right, so now let's turn a little bit more to Locke. Now, first thing, when you read Locke and you think about him, we're going to notice that there's a bit of a change here. Locke's not talking about strict identity. Because if you talk about strict identity, like something that has to be absolutely the same and no change whatsoever, almost nothing satisfies that strict demand. So this absolute, and David Hume will talk about this later, that the whole notion of strict identity is a kind of fiction. Nothing in our experience satisfies it. We postulate it, we use it, it's an important concept, we use it all the time, but ultimately it is really a fiction. You never experience it. Locke is more or less along those lines. So when he's talking about identity over time and diversity and all these things, he's really thinking more of a looser notion, like same thing over time, right? Not absolute, strict, radical identity, no change whatsoever. He's not talking about that. He's talking about when you see something change, why do you say, well, yeah, it's changing a lot, but it's still the same thing roughly over time. So some people say, well, instead of using identity, we should use another term like gen identity, like in the same sort of category, identical and in the same category. You can make up a bunch of terms. I just want you to understand that we're really talking about same thing, or in a way, you know, sameness, right? That's when we attribute sameness to something. All right, so Locke is trying to account for why we say something is the same X. So why we say X is the same X while X changes over time. That's really what Locke is after. What do we mean by that? What's really going on when we say it's the same X, even though it's changing over time? So it's not a strict identity, it's a sameness notion. What's going on there? Locke's point is that when we answer this, it will depend on different conditions, right? Remember we talked about just a second ago, identity conditions. Well, think about sameness. There are conditions here too. Now, this is a very long and complicated chapter. God's in there, all kinds of, souls and minds and all kinds of things are in there. But the basic thrust of what Locke is after is fairly straightforward. But again, like typical situations with most of these great philosophers, there's a lot of subtlety involved as well. So let's think about how things are identical over time. So think about something like an atom, a collection of atoms. So there's two things we can talk about as identical or sameness over time. How is an atom same over time? And an atom, I'm just thinking of, or imagine like a little hard kind of billiard ball thing, not the complex atom of modern quantum mechanics, but just this notion of atom in a classical sense, right? Just think of it, I sometimes imagine it kind of as a little sphere, right? Just like that. How is that the same over time? That's really not a problem because nothing really changes in it. If it's just sitting there, there's no change. So talking about its sameness over time, that seems pretty close to being self-evident. What about if it moves, right? If the atom now moves, right, and ends up like here, again. Well, so it goes from A to B. So how do we say that the atom at A is the same as the atom at B? Well, it seems to be that we can have some kind of trajectory, right? Illustrated by my little squiggly arrow, that it follows this same path and nothing has changed in it within that path. So there is, again, some kind of explanation of the identity conditions, and in this case it would be, well, the thing has followed this path, and so we'll say it's the same atom. We often do that, right? Same thing. If I do that, if I take this and I move it from there to there, you're not going to be all confused. And I'd say, well, what makes this pen here the same as the pen here? You'd say, well, you just moved it, right? And you're presupposing that nothing has changed it fundamentally in this notion of transport. I transported it from here to here. Didn't change anything, same pen. How about if we bump it up, make it a little more complicated? A group of atoms, a collection, right? So now we're talking about a group. So now we've got, which is a little bit tougher to draw, so I'll kind of draw kind of like this. Well, if you've got a collection of them and you want to ask, what about them over time? So it's now you're starting to have to make up some conditions and think about it, right? What makes this group the same thing over time? Well, if you don't move any of the atoms out or bring anyone in, you might say, well, that's going to make it the same of time. You could jumble it up, right? So if let's say they're different colors, if this one is like red and this guy's green, you might be able to switch the red and the green, but you're not taking any of them out. You're not putting any in. So maybe, different ways of organizing the cluster. You might say that keeps it the same. You might even argue, no, it's a different cluster. Once you reorganize, it's a different group. So now we've got, well, it's the same mass, but it's not absolutely identical when I switch the atoms around, even within in the cluster. So you can have, really now, once you get into more complex objects, we're really talking more about sameness. Because you'd say, wow, okay, if I switch these two, so I'll use the little arrows here to indicate, the red goes to the green and the green. You would say, now we're talking about, well, it's still the same ensemble, the same group. So now we're talking about sameness, right? So it's not as strict as this one, but it's a little looser. So now we've moved from a strict identity to a looser notion of sameness, right? Same thing I was talking about here. So what's the point? Well, as you get more complex objects in the story, you start bringing in more conditions, you shift away from strict identity onto sameness. So what are the conditions now of sameness? Well, you'd say sameness is, as long as you don't yank any of these little atoms out and replace them, it's going to be the same. You can get into more complicated questions. Well, what's the difference really between one red atom and another red atom? If I replaced one red atom with a different red atom, that group would behave in the same way, and for all intents and purposes, is that really a change? Well, welcome to the discussion of identity. Is it really the same or different? It's certainly not radically identical like we had in this case, but now you're in the identity conditions of sameness. So the more complex the object, more complex the identity conditions. So try to get your head around that identity conditions can increase in complexity. Now, we said that if you lose one of the atoms here from the group, that it's not the same group anymore. That seems to make sense. Yeah, yank an atom out of that group, right? I got $100 in the bank, yank a dollar or two out of there. I don't have the same group of money in the bank. It's not $100 anymore. So that doesn't seem too problematic. So the identity conditions could be same mass. So the sameness would be unpacked in terms of same matter or material or mass, however, whatever. The point is that it's going to have a physical grounding, right? This one's a strict physical. This is a looser one, but it's still a physical grounding. So when we talk about it, we still are anchoring our identity conditions in physical conditions. But Locke says things get a little more complicated when we start thinking about living creatures, oaks and brutes. But now we're bumping it up. Living creatures, like an oak tree or a brute. That's just the word for animals, right? So a brute is an animal, an oak tree. Well, wait a second. This gets more complicated. Look at any tree, right? Well, except for evergreens. Look at trees that, shall we say, the trees that fit my example are the ones that lose their leaves. They shed matter all the time. Actually, an evergreen tree does too, right? The needles do drop off on trees. So what's the point here? Well, these things, along with animals, wait a second, these shed matter and absorb it. right? Think about it. When an oak tree takes in materials from its environment, which it does, takes in materials from the soil, and with its operations, photosynthesis and all that stuff. So the oak tree absorbs materials from its environment and makes more of itself, grows, more bark, more leaves, and then also sheds this stuff. So, some branches fall off, leaves fall off. So the oak tree exchanges materials with its environment. Think about an animal, like a brute. They do even more of that, right? Because you think about what does an animal do with its food? Well, the animal's body is kind of like a food splitter. Part of the food is absorbed to make more of the animal, to repair parts of the animal. The other part is eliminated as waste. So the material that the animal absorbs is brought in, separated, used. Some is eliminated, some is kept. And of course, the animal is not just simply eliminating waste. The animal is also shedding, like we do, shedding little bits of skin all the time. So the skin that you shed is partly at one time living skin that was built by your body using food and all that stuff. And then eventually it's dumped out. You exchange, you breathe out carbon dioxide, you breathe in oxygen, all these kinds of things. So you, me, the brutes, oak trees, we are constantly exchanging matter with the environment. Now, we don't say that because I'm undergoing respiration, I'm exchanging, and I am literally exchanging materials with the environment, breathing one thing in and breathing another thing out, etc., etc. We don't say that I'm different, right? I'm not a different man. This is not a different oak or a different brute. So here now, we shift. It's not matter-based. So sameness now is not matter-based. So sameness, and I'll put a line here to make sure we keep all of our stuff nice and tidy. There we go. So sameness in this question is not matter-based. Rather, Locke says, what's going on here? Well, that tree in your front yard that's been there year after year starts off as a little acorn, right? We don't say the acorn is absolutely identical to the big oak tree, because it's clearly not. But we would say something that little acorn became that oak tree, or that oak tree grew out of the acorn. But what would we say? Well, it's not exactly the same particular thing, but it is the same oak example, or the same oak life, if you want, or basically the same continuous life. So now we've got a functional notion coming into play. Like our ship of Theseus, you could run it on the material line or the functional line. A lot of people say, let's go with the functional line. If you don't go with the functional line, then you'd have to be saying things like, well, that's not really the same tree year after year in the front. Like, not only is it not identical, it's not even the same tree. So Locke is saying that this would just make a mess of our language if we didn't have sameness shifting onto the grounds of away from material onto functional. All right, so far so good. This seems to make sense. Gets a little more complicated, and this is where all the subtlety starts coming in. But the basic picture is really not too bad. Locke is going to say something like this. All right, let's look a little bit more at living creatures. And now, let's look at the notion of a man, right? Woman doesn't matter. I'm just following Locke's logic. What do we say is the same man over time? Now, the important thing is Locke is going to split the notion of same man from same person. So the same man over time, this is very much like Just the same body over time, right? Say as the same body over time. This like my body is just doing its thing, its respiration, all that stuff, digestion, etc., etc. So it is the same. And I don't want to say I because that's begging the question, but this is the same that did the previous video, and I hope we'll do some more videos unless I'm in big trouble. The notion of same man over time, this too is functional. And it's ultimately a, shall we say, biological. Okay, so we can put this here. So the same man over time, again, it's functional. It's not strictly matter-based because, your body, my body, they're constantly exchanging matter with the environment. But here's the thing. Remember, we're talking about personal identity. Locke separates, hives off personal identity and the notion of person from a body, right? And this is how he's in the Cartesian tradition, because Descartes also split the notion of yourself from your body, right? In the meditations when he's like talking about what the self is, and this is the, I think therefore I am stuff, and Descartes wants to say that the self, the thinking thing, or that which thinks and feels, is not to be identified with the body that happens to house it. Locke is saying, yeah, that's basically right. I'm going to follow you on that one, but I'm not going to quite go as far as you want, Descartes. Descartes then said, well, what is this? And he started tying it to a soul, and he had another story to tell. Locke ultimately thinks that's probably how God built the system, that we are, your personal identity is rooted in a soul. But his empiricist framework won't allow him to say that definitively. So Locke is going to be a little bit more reserved, a little bit more, shall we say, small c, conservative about this. I don't really know. So for Locke, now the same person, he's going to ask, what makes you the same person over time, right? And this is not going to depend on matter. This is not going to depend even on your body, because Locke does allow that, maybe your person, whatever it is, that could be moved into different bodies, like, picked up and transported over. God could do it. It could happen. So what makes us say that we are the same person over time? It's not going to be, so it's identity condition. So identity condition is not going to be biological in any way. So what makes you the same person over time is not the same thing as what makes your body the same body over time, right? In other words, if we could do, standard science fiction stories and standard stories we do in philosophy, is, imagine, we could, take off more and more of your body. You'd still be the same person. Some people want to argue you wouldn't, but in the classical mode of discussion, the idea is that you'd still be the same person, even if you lost your legs, and then you can start doing this more of a reduction of the body, and you'd still say at the end, you could just be a brain floating in a vat, and you'd still be the same person. And then if I said, oh, well, I'm going to take that brain and I'm going to encode it in a special kind of program and pipe it into a computer and then destroy that brain. Now all of a sudden we're talking about you being encoded in some kind of computer or whatever. There's no more bodily continuity whatsoever. It's completely gone. Are you still there? If your intuitions point to, yeah, that's still me, then you've split the notion of person, same person, identity condition away from the biological. Well, what is it now? What's it going to be? What's it grounded in? You've stripped it. There's no more biological, so the identity condition now, if it's not biological, what is it? What makes you the same person What makes me the same person? What makes all of us the same person as we were yesterday? Locke's not denying that you were the same person. He's just asking you what's the identity condition for it. Now, he talks a good game about a variety of things, lots of subtleties in here. And Locke's theory of personal identity has become known as the memory condition of identity, even though Locke never quite says that. What Locke actually says is that the same person is based on the notion of the same consciousness. So as far back, he says, as I can extend my consciousness, that is what makes my present consciousness, like my present sort of awareness, linked to a past awareness, is because I can somehow extend it back. What does this extending back mean? Well, it seems that what Locke is talking about is the ability to use memory. So who you are is really a construction of your memories. So that is how far you can remember back. Now, this becomes quite a subtle discussion because there are easy reactions to this. You could say something like this: look, man, if that's the case, you get some weird things happen. What if I do something that's illegal? I do something terrible, and then I forget that I did it. Should I be, and then I go to court, and I say honestly, well, there's a lot of people do when they get into trouble. They say, well, what this, and I don't remember that. Is that really a good excuse if you say, yeah, it's possible that that was me, but you know what? I don't think it really was because I don't remember it, and I can't really push my sort of consciousness back to that incident. It's not in my memory, so it's not really me. Is that what we want? So Locke's theory of this notion of extending the consciousness back is one that's a bit tricky, but the basic idea that he wants is, how do we have something that we can observe? We can observe operations of the mind through our, remember, memory is one of our faculties, right? So it's a power. So this power of recollection and, contemplation, remember the two things that were important. You can call something up and you can look at it in terms of your memory. Locke thinks that that's ultimately going to be an empirically friendly way of grounding personal identity over time. So we've come a long way. It's not personal identity in the sense of strict identity. It's a notion of sameness. It's got conditions. How do we maintain this same X while X changes over time? Well, we looked at living creatures. They shed and absorb matter. So sameness is not matter-based. It's functional. Okay, and that's how our bodies work. So same female body, same male body is going to be split from, same person over time. So we've got the body-person split happening. The body one comes in the same thing as brutes, and as oak trees. So we're organic in that sense, just natural living creatures. That's a functional base. Sometimes Locke likes to say, same life, right? So that oak tree in front of your house, that's the same oak life. That bear that lives in the woods all those years, that we say, it's the same bear. I see him every summer. That's the same bear life, right? Sameness is unpacked in these biological conditions. Of course, Locke now opens the door to hiving off same person from same body, right? So same man is not the same thing as same person. Same person is not the same thing as same woman. Who knows? Maybe Locke has opened the doors to brutes now also having that split. Don't we sometimes say, oh, my dog is like a little person, right? Are we, elevating or respecting or recognizing whatever that this split between same body, same animal life, and same person can happen in, shall we use Locke's term, in a brute? So in this sense now, same consciousness, and this term consciousness, has a lot of 16th 17th century connotations of it, which I'm not going to get into. But basically, for us, just as a first step, think of it as a kind of memory theory, which is often what it's referred to. But Locke is a little bit more subtle than that. Now, there's lots of problems. Like, well, what about, if I forget something? So is Locke just saying you have to be able to, so here's a little bit of subtlety with Locke. And I'll end on this note to think about, because this section of the essay, that is book 2, chapter 27, has generated a cottage industry of discussions and forms in some way, the basis of more modern philosophical approaches to personal identity, either to fix up Locke, become a neo-quasi-Lockean, or to reject it, right? So like it or not, if you're interested in personal identity, you got to deal with Locke. But Locke can be a little bit tricky and a little bit subtle, and I'm just going to end on this note. Locke might be saying something which is, shall we say, a direct notion of consciousness, like, yeah, you have to be able to directly remember something in order for you to be that same person. So from here at A, you got to be able to B, you got to have sort of a little memory in here of that. So that kind of direct model. So let's call that our direct model. And Locke seems to talk like that. So if you don't have, shall we say, we'll put a little b in here. So if A now, and then, if it's a direct model, then A now must have a little memory of B then, and then that's the same consciousness. Then you get your identity, your conditions, or your sameness conditions. That's a direct one. Big problems, because if I don't remember what went on at B, then I could have the same body, and then I'd say, hey, I don't remember it, was it me? You can get into, and you can generate even more problems with it. Because, if I remember, let's say, here's something at C, and I have a memory that goes here and picks up a memory of C, but not of B, and then I have one that links this way, then A can remember C, but can't remember B, but C can remember B. You can get into all kinds of funny contradictions, namely violations of logic with this one. So this lends itself to all kinds of problems. If Locke is saying that, he's got some immediate problems on his hands. But Locke might not be offering this direct model. He might be offering what is something that might look like this. A now looks like this. B. In other words, A somehow can remember an earlier state, which is linked to earlier states, which linked like this. So when you want to have same person over time, it doesn't have to be a direct memory like this. There just has to be continuity. So you think of it as kind of like little consciousnesses in the plural that kind of overlap all the way back. If there are no gaps here, right, then we can we could say that well, yeah, A is the same person as B because it's a continuous link from A to B, but it's not direct. So A right now may not have a memory of B, right? But that's okay. But if in the direct model, that causes problems. But in the continuity model, it doesn't. This seems to be a little bit more like our normal experiences because sometimes we would say, well, if you don't remember B, maybe we can help you to dig out these memories or whatnot. But we often say, look, just because you don't remember doing something, that doesn't mean that you didn't do it, right? So we tend to think probably more along these lines if we're in this kind of Lockean framework. Locke might be hinting at something like this. This is certainly the direction that a lot of, shall we say, neo-Lockeans went and read Locke down into this and said, this is a better way to read Locke than this straightforward way. But, as I said, that is a matter of interpretation of the text. The big takeaway here is that Locke on personal identity wants to split identity and a looser notion of sameness. This is what we really talk about. Sameness is talking about something that changes over time. Well, changing over time, not a problem in the simple case of the atom. Bigger problem here based on material mass. That's the identity condition. Bigger problem here when you got matter circulating, exchanging. Well, then sameness talks about a functional, biological same life. And then last but not least, when he really gets into the thing about personal identity, it is not a functional biological. It is, if anything, it's functional in terms of the specific faculty of the mind, namely this faculty that he called memory. And memory then provides this link, this same thing over time, but it's not quite sure if it's a direct or a continuous model. That's still, as I said, a matter of discussion. Locke probably talks more like this, but it's certainly not beyond reason that you can argue that he's hinting in this direction. So, lots of stuff to think about, but again, Locke is avoiding postulating an immortal soul or anything like that. He just doesn't think, he thinks that you have one, and then he thinks God gave you one and God's going to make it all work out. Don't worry about it. But basically, from an empirical framework, as we saw Locke say earlier, there's just things you can't know. Get used to it. It's not God's fault. God's given us enough stuff to know. Maybe we can never have a perfect answer, but we can certainly have one that's pretty good at the end. All right, so that wraps it up. Stay tuned for further videos.